Hi. Thanks. Cool. So I think this talk was titled like or education innovation with the blockchain, which is like kind of what it is, but not exactly. More so, I'm talking about the mathetic opportunity in distributed computing. Mathematics is the science of learning, and so the topic is how does the presence of distributed computing systems and crypto systems in society change how people learn? And so basically, you can frame this in two ways. One, like fast forward into the future, right, where everything worked, blockchains are everywhere, people are using this to run societies, schools, governments, banks, whatever. This technology is omnipresent in our days, right? So kids, children, are actually interacting with decentralized systems in their day-to-day lives. And so the question this raises is, how does this change their minds? How does the structure of the way they approach life, learning, and knowledge change as a result of interacting with these systems? And this may seem like potentially putting a little too much onto like blockchain systems, right? Like, is this changing people? But I think it does. I think a lot of us would agree that it's sort of a very fundamental perspective shift, kind of in the lineage of computing as an innovation. And so I think this is a really valid question. And I think we need to care about how the things we build changes people's minds. We need to care about how it transforms the way you think about the world. And so what this comes down to is learning, is the creation of knowledge, and learning at multiple levels. Learning within an individual, how do I learn in relation to society? How do I create knowledge in myself? Learning in relation to a community, how do we learn what it means to do sharding, or how do we learn any of this? How do we create knowledge? And so I would like to tie a lot of this back to a specific theory of knowledge from a psychologist called Jared Pereira called constructivism. And basically what this boils down to is this idea that knowledge is constructed within individuals based on the interaction between what you experience and your ideas. So for a little just frame, I'm gonna jump into constructivism, sort of theory of knowledge, then I'm gonna jump into learning, and then I'm gonna pull it back to like, how does this actually influence what we're doing? So constructivism. This is how people construct knowledge, how I decide what it means to know something. I have an experience, I have an idea, and those two might have a difference, and I attempt to reconcile them. This is coming from a genetic epistemology perspective, which is essentially tracing back the genesis of knowledge. And how does that, if we study that, what does that teach us about knowledge? So it's the two major concepts in it are this idea of assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is when I take experiences I have in the world and I fit them to my ideas. So you could kind of frame it as, when you, I'm sure this has happened to all of you, where you go out in the world and you're faced with a problem and you're like, oh yeah, probably a blockchain could fix that, right? We're assimilating the world into our mental models. An accommodation is when you change your mental model to fit the world, where it's like, oh, I entirely thought that this would work, this would be easy, and turns out the world doesn't work that way, and I have to change the way I approach things. And so this theory, I think, was around, sort of propagated in 40s, 50s, somewhere around there. And it focuses specifically on just like, what is knowledge? It doesn't really focus on a process by which we can propagate knowledge or create knowledge. And so sometime after Jared Pereira, there was this proposal for constructionism, which is a learning theory. And weakly, it's this idea of learning by doing. You do things, and then you build things, or you write things, and that creates knowledge in yourself. More strongly, it's this idea of learning by creating meaningful artifacts. Meaningful meaning that they have an impact on your experience. So your ideas will only change, or change most effectively, when the artifacts you're creating have an impact on your experience, right? It's that relationship between ideas and the world again. And so this was put forward by Seymour Papert, who is this really incredible mind. He was a pediatric psychologist, AI researcher, and computer scientist, so this really neat intersection. And it sort of recasts Jean Piaget as an epistemologist. Instead of like him just studying how children learn, what we're really studying when we study learning is the genesis of knowledge itself, or what it means to define knowledge. So Popper kind of proposed this idea that like, okay, if we understand that knowledge occurs in these ways, we can, and we understand that knowledge, when you're constructing knowledge, when you're actually having experiences, you're using models, information, and resources that come from your environment, using like things your parents told you, things you see, the idea of basically culture impermeating mental models. And so we can actually construct environments, Popper calls these micro-worlds, in order to intentionally give people learning powerful ideas. And so the most important piece here, and this is sort of like the core of the exciting ideas that Popper produced, which was computers, the generalized computational environment, can be a constructed environment for meta-methetic ideas. So methetic, the science of learning. Meta would be like basically thinking about, learning about, thinking about, it loops back on itself and I'm being messy, but the idea is that we can impart ideas about the construction of knowledge to self through computers. And this kind of stems on the idea that everything in a computer is knowledge that's constructed by people, right? When you're coding, when you're interacting with it, you're constructing systems. You're kind of teaching the computer. And through teaching the computer, perhaps we can learn to teach ourselves. And so this is also kind of, this is a very long quote. The important part is first. The separation between the learning process and what is learned is a mistake. Essentially, the separation between teaching and the idea, like, so basically, in order to teach something to someone else, you have to understand what that is. And these processes are not things that happen first you understand and then you teach. They're actually intrinsically tied together. And this is something that I think a lot of people resonate with, but is not reflected in the models that we actually engage with in the world. So this Popper kind of was very prolific in learning theory in the 70s, wrote a book called Mindstorms, which I highly recommend, and the question is like, what happened with that? And so they had this environment called Logo, and it was really, really cool, and it was kind of like fairly well distributed, and it was, I don't know if any of you interacted with Turtle. It's essentially like a tiny little turtle that you tell to go up, right, left, and it draws pictures on the screen. And it was a way to teach children computer science. And it kind of worked. It was a, I think, starting point for a lot of people. And then we also had ideas like Smalltalk from Alan Kay, which was a academic programming, and it is still prominent in computer science curriculums today. And these are all stemming from the same ideas of like, can we create learning environments that are computational environments that teach people how to learn? And we have like things like boot camps propagating something quite kind of like computer science today. But really, there hasn't really been a broad change in education nor a widespread computational literacy. There's still a large gap between the potential for these ideas and how they've actually manifested in society. And so here's the question of like, how can we use these things in order to change that? In order to, what is the opportunity that is presented in this new paradigm? And so generally the paradigm I'm talking about is like crypto systems or social computation, which is kind of ill-defined, but generally I mean things like Ethereum, Git, so just like distributed Merkle trees, other cryptographic social networks like Secure Scuttlebutt, and they change things in two ways. Number one is an unprecedented pervasiveness. Computers were previously, or computation was previously largely an individual thing, right? You exist on your computer talks to other computers as individuals, servers, but now we're taking this idea and sort of making it fundamentally social, where the interactions between different computational environments is constructing sort of a shared reality, and this provides the opportunity for a computational mindset to infiltrate society at a much, much higher level than just like computers as workstations. And then the second thing is, because it's social, it gives us new social metaphors for talking about computation. It gives the ideas of forking, consensus, merge conflicts, web of trust. It's all of these things that help us and help people think about both computers and reality. And so it also gives us potentially the opportunity to try and do this better. We're rebroadcasting a lot of these core ideas of computational learning, or we have the opportunity to rebroadcast them in the systems we build, in the systems that change the world. So what if we do that? We build new foundations with this idea of learning at all levels as sort of a core piece of it. And so there's lots of little ways we can do this, and I recognize that this is sort of extremely vague or fuzzy, which is because learning as an idea is sort of extremely vague and fuzzy. It's specifically related on the creation of knowledge. And so I think what I'm going to try to do here is just lots of little pieces where I think we can exemplify these traits, and perhaps through the little pieces we can construct a meaningful whole. So the three areas is we can build tools for learning, right? We can actually use the systems to build specifically learning tools. Also, all tools we build, regardless of whether they're for academics or learning or not, can have learning-oriented or learning-first features, right? Like, even if we're building governance systems, learning can be a first-class citizen there. And learning can be a way to build tools. The way we research, the way we develop, that learning can be a first-class citizen there too. And so tools for learning, I work on a project called Fathom, and this is kind of what we're thinking about, like how do we put together assessment systems in order to allow people to learn freely. And there are also other sort of dApps or systems we can build to do that, like prediction market systems for sourcing and incentivizing new knowledge. There's a lot more there potentially, but this is kind of the most obvious point. And the more subtle ones, I think, are things we should have in tools. For example, this idea of view source, which is something that's really taken for granted in web browsers, but like we don't really think about it in terms of smart contract systems. This idea of making available, again, the computational ideas to the people who are interacting with these systems. Simulations, allowing people to play with the crypto systems we build. I don't know if any of you guys, there's this really good simulation of game theory as a way, I forget what it's called, but that's the URL, where essentially you pick strategies and simulate a bunch of runs of game theory agents doing it. And it's a really playful, interactive way to learn the ideas of game theory. Or do we need security-like signals? So the way web browsers signal security to the users, do we need to signal learning? Do we need to signal that the website is open source, or the smart contracts are open source? Do we need to make that as primary a goal as security? Which is, a little radical, but ideas. Or there are also systems we can take that are making our development and research systems fundamentally respect learning, right? So moving away from this kind of like production or product-driven work cycle where it's like I build a thing, release it to the world, iterate on that, and more so to the idea that people through their learning or through just constructing knowledge in themselves and others can arise meaningful artifacts. This is kind of the fuzziest, but I think it's also the most interesting. How do we create essentially things like research institutions, but research institutions more fundamentally in line with the work that we do, as opposed to a distinct entity like they exist in modern education. So just some closing thoughts. I started this talk with like jumping to the future and being like, what happens when we change children? But I do think that like the benefits of thinking deeply about learning are important today. They're not only things we build today for the future, but things that influence and help us build better. And most importantly, I think to me, this idea that hiding the novelty of what we're doing is not a good idea. We need to embrace the fact that the things, systems, ideas we're talking about are they're not fundamentally new, right? They have a lineage, but they are new. They're new systems, and we shouldn't disguise that to people. We shouldn't try and swindle people into thinking that this is the same as what they've always known. We should create bridges to allow them to come into this new paradigm and change their minds. This is kind of like a question going into UX and UI and kind of research like that, and I think it's a very loaded question, but it's important to think deeply on the ideas we're propagating. And don't we want to propagate the ideas that let us do what we're doing? And kind of like on a more optimistic note, there's a lot of talk in education about the school of the future. And I think really the school of the future looks like the things we're doing, right? The things as an industry we're learning and going on with, and everything happening there. And so we're doing pretty good. This industry is open and collaborative and stemming directly from the lineage of the open source movement. And so we're on the right path. But we still need to foster a culture that respects learning as a fundamental part of progress, of work, and of the things we all do. Briefly, if you want to get in touch, that's by email. I don't have business cards or anything. And that's the project I work on, Fathom.network. Cool. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. So I have 10 minutes. If there are questions, cool. If not, cool.
Hey, thank you for your talk, first of all. Super important subject matter, something that I think a lot of people need to think about, especially as we want to grow the industry. We have to think about how we educate people and how we onboard people into the industry. One of the things that you mentioned was that hiding the novelty of our work isn't a good idea. I don't want to use this time to promote my ideas, but I think one of the things that I think about, and I would love to hear your thoughts on, is how we, as an industry, sometimes project a lot of complexity outwards so that we kind of have this allure and we build up our own kind of egos, but that also pushes people away, and that's not conducive to bringing people on and educating them. So just what are your thoughts on that, and how do we, as an industry, help or change that? Thanks.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty agreed on that being a bad thing, right? We don't want this aura of mysticism of this is special knowledge that only we can have, and projecting that, and even things like developing our own language for talking about it can form a real wall to people coming in. I think the solution is not right. We shouldn't be hiding complexity. We should be creating higher level ideas that make them easy to propagate. So we should be recasting the knowledge we have in ways that is easy to transmit, and while still not losing what makes it fundamentally what it is, right? We shouldn't make it disappear. We should make it present in a way that people can understand. And I think what's cool about that is if we do it correctly, it recasts our understanding as well. It's not like we are the giving knowledge. It's this continuous process of translating knowledge and engaging with it in new ways that makes the industry better, makes individuals better, and propagates a culture of information, kind of. Yeah.
Cool, awesome talk. Have you thought about how we might be able to target, get involvement from different communities and just kind of bring this understanding? We're both spreading knowledge, but we're also kind of engaging knowledge that is dormant in communities. And so have you thought about how we might do that and get more people involved from different backgrounds?
I think it's a two-part thing. One is we need to have not necessarily extremely rigorous, but good definitions of what it all fundamentally is, right? So it's not all fundamentally about coding or cryptography or anything like that, and saying it is alienates other communities. But if we can come up with a shared common basis that is okay, if you're interacting in this thought space, this is what we're talking about, then that can be an onboarding point for any kind of community. You can kind of drop into an existing knowledge base and be join us here. This is the pathway. And then the second is sort of, I think, tied to that one, which is just like expanding our definitions of what is valuable work in this space, and kind of opening the doors to let people engage how they can. I think it's a hard problem, but I think the easy solution is just like create opportunities for it, like give people money for weird things and new things and different spaces and all sorts of stuff like that.
You said that what we're doing is new, but it comes from a lineage of thought. And so particularly as it relates to constructivism, can you talk a little bit about the lineage that what we're doing comes out of? Because I don't know anything about the background. Like, how has constructivism been applied since its creation?
So constructivism being the theory of knowledge, or constructionism?
Sorry,
it's a really messy language.
Constructionism.
Yeah, so constructionism was like largely propagated in the 70s, kind of by, I think, a group at the MIT Media Lab, and I think the #1 lineage of that was Logo and Turtle and sort of Smalltalk, and this general idea of, I think they really kind of propagated object-oriented programming as like one of the first things. Like Smalltalk really put that idea out there as sort of a novel metaphor to think about programs, and so that's kind of where that came from in terms of a lineage. Constructionism kind of, at least since the 2000s, I think it has not seen as much of a vitalization in society. I think it is present in the open source movement though, and how people engage with software in general, right? The idea that like forking, running, experimenting with software is a way to learn is kind of still becoming a thing. That wasn't a very robust answer, and I don't have a very robust timeline for it, but I would love to get into that more. Cool.
So I guess I have a question about what you see in the community now. Do you believe that there is that a large percentage of the community is actually learning, or do you think that it is memorization?
No, so this is interesting. I think there was like a tweet from Vlad a while ago that was like, maybe the most important thing that came out of this is all the learning it inspired, right? Like, I think there is a genuine shift in mindsets and a genuine progress being made in how people create knowledge. I think there is new knowledge being created in selves, right? And that's present just in how eagerly people are attacking the world. It's like, we got this thing that we think is exciting, we're gonna apply it to everything. And through applying it to everything, we're going to change ourselves and change the world. And I think that's sort of evidence of there being something new here and something new in people's minds. And I think there is a large element of potentially cargo cultism and not totally engaging with the fundamental pieces of knowledge, but there is a movement towards it. And I would broadly think that most people working in this space do learn and are learning and creating new things. Yeah. There was someone.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for the talk. I got a question I wanted to relate to a talk that we heard this morning with Rain, and she was talking about, again, onboarding people into the industry and how we can do that. And I think, as you said, that we have shared interest with other communities. I think about the artificial intelligence community, for example. They need to onboard people and to make them, not be afraid of that. My question is, do you think that as an industry we have kind of a disadvantage, in the blockchain industry, to onboard people because of either the much trolling that you get when you try to enter the community, and of the sometimes bad image that you get through the many scams in the projects? Is that some kind of disadvantage for the industry?
Probably, right? The way people engage with this, if the way people engage with this ideas is by the noise that we project, then that's sort of seeding the wrong thoughts. It's setting us off from the start. And I think potentially you could tie the image problems or the trolling to a problem with our understanding ourselves. I think we're still, where we don't totally have robust ideas of the knowledge we're working with. We're still building the framework, and because we exist in this in-between space, social experiences like trolling, like extreme signaling, are a way of survival, a way of people to work with this stuff. And I think changing that will be fundamentally an idea of learning, and us learning about ourselves in order to come to a strong shared understanding and culture before we can, or through a process of taking that outwards. Yeah. Cool. Thanks.